Now, in order to have judgment, you need to have memory. And so what we'll see somewhere around 0.03 is initial memory impairment. Now, doesn't mean that you become in a blackout state, which is total memory impairment, but it means that your recall and your coding into memory gets impaired at this stage, about 0.03. Now, you need memory to have judgment. And so impaired judgment is the level legally drunk for a commercial driver's license, bus drivers, limo drivers, and the like. So that's what legally drunk is for them because of impaired judgment. You people need to remember they don't run red lights. Yellow does not mean go faster if you're driving a bus or something like that. It means slow down and stop. So in order to make that judgment, you need to remember certain critical things. So 0.04 is impaired judgment, and that's legally drunk for a commercial driver's license. For the rest of us in this state, impaired coordination starts at about 0.08, or is 0.08, and that's legally drunk for everyone else. Now, becomes interesting what happens after this level. So when I talk about people needing to understand what legally drunk is for them, is that legally drunk is dependent exactly upon how much alcohol you drink and how much your ideal body weight is, right? If you gain weight, you can't drink more. It doesn't mean you can drink more. You still have the same amount of blood. So what happens then after 0.08 is things like impaired speech. You start slurring your words because your brain is becoming sedated, and the way the brain works is when it's cut off from its oxygen supply, the least life-threatening brain functions go first. And impaired speech is one of those, somewhere after legally drunk. And then hypnosis, where you're basically in a state where you're kind of staring off into space. Spacing out, as they used to say. Clinical anesthesia. The term for this, the street term for this is he felt no pain. He was feeling no pain. And literally this is true. At this level of intoxication, the brain ceases to process pain signal in real time. So often what happens, especially where if someone's in a blackout condition, their memory and their judgment have already been impaired, so they tend to become combative, and even if you hit them with a 2x4 to get their attention, they don't feel it and it doesn't stop them, so they definitely get combative then. So clinical anesthesia, they're literally not feeling pain. In the Civil War, for example, they give you, some whiskey so that they can operate on your leg or whatever, or amputate your leg because you don't feel it. Incontinence. This is a state, basically, you lose your potty training. And a lot of people find, when they especially see these at frat parties and sorority parties where somebody has, passed out on a couch or something like that and they've peed or shat themselves, you lose your potty training, getting, as the term goes, shit-faced drunk or pissy drunk or whatever. They think that's funny, but this is actually a dangerous state. So remember what's happening with the brain. You usually don't wet the bed as an adult because your brain has retained your potty training under normal circumstances. Right? So what happens in this state is the brain is now engaged with keeping you alive. So the next level below incontinence, and this is why you have to watch out if somebody pisses or shits themselves, and you'll often see this with examples of homeless people that have gotten so drunk that they have done this to themselves. The next level above that is coma of intoxication. Excuse me, is coma. Now, at this point, what happens in the brain is still breathing for you and beating your heart, but you're unresponsive. So I actually knew a client, a student here who was in the high school completion program who went to a kegger in the woods and had 7 pints that at which point he lost count, 7 pints of microbrew at this kegger. And what happened to him is that he passed out and woke up 3 days later. And there was this homeless guy that he woke up in front of the kid woke up in front of a campfire covered with a blanket, and there was this homeless guy sitting there, and he goes, "Where am I?" And he says, "Oh, you were with that kegger 3 nights ago." So he had fallen asleep. So consider under what circumstances you could sleep for 3 days straight. He was in a coma. He was 17. Coma was induced by drinking 8 pints of Hammerhead. Not to give any free play to the Magnanimance chain, but I'm just telling you, people can die from alcohol. He was in an alcohol-induced coma. So one of the things that when people, get shit-faced drunk, pissy drunk, it's really easy to kill yourself using alcohol. Incredibly easy. And people think that it's just because it's legal, it's safe. Well, that's an illusion. So after coma, your breathing stops. And this, you can tell this state because someone has been passed out and the lips are turning blue. At this point, you actually need to begin CPR, if not before that. You need to be able to monitor their breathing because 5 minutes without breath and your heart stops. And if they don't bring you back soon enough, you're dead. Now, if you notice, the death is a variable blood alcohol level depending on how old you are and how much you weigh. So 0.21. So let me start actually in the extreme right. The LD50. The LD50 is lethal dose for 50% of whatever you tested the drug on. So all pharmaceuticals have an LD50. Okay, based on body weight. So alcohol intoxication, like any other drug, is a dose to weight relationship. The LD50 is 0.45 to 0.50 blood alcohol level. Now that is for a naive adult. And a naive adult is an adult without inherited drug tolerance. All right? So regularly the cops actually stop drunk drivers who blow 0.55, meaning everybody else would be dead. These individuals are still awake driving motor vehicles. So generally speaking, the LD50 for a naive adult is 0.45 to 0.50. That being said, 0.21 was a 100-pound, 14-year-old middle school girl from a local middle school in town here that had 4 beers and a shot of vodka. And that coded her, meaning her breathing stopped, her heart rate stopped on the way to Sacred Heart. Okay, when she was found passed out on the lawn in the South Hills. Okay, and basically the hospital said that she had a 0.21 blood alcohol level and she arrived coded. They were able to bring her back, okay, from alcohol poisoning. That's 0.21, 100-pound middle school girl. 0.35 on the chart. Okay, we regularly lose college students at that level from things like fraternity hazings, sorority initiations, etc., where they're basically binge drinking as part of their initiation into a fraternity and they die at 0.35. So that's still below the LD50 for a naive adult. So I'm still talking about college-age folks, where alcohol becomes part of the cause of death and they become part of the statistic that is 1,757 crashing every day. And that was just in the year 2000. So when you combine other sedative hypnotic drugs with alcohol, you have a synergistic, also known as potentiating effect. So rather than having an additive effect like 2 plus 3, it's like 2 times 3. So it's like 6 times the effect of either drug alone. So when we talk about dosage and potency, obviously dosage is the amount of drug to be taken at any one time and the intervals at which it should be taken. So as an example, with alcohol, you have the dosages that I gave you. Your body processes the alcohol, the drug alcohol, at the rate of about 1 dose per hour, no faster than that. So obviously if you drink a case of beer, it will take you 24 hours to process that dose of beer. For example, if you drink a case, right? 24 hours, because there's, if it's regular regular beer, 2 to 3 point beer, 24 of them, 1 dose per hour is what you will process, even though you can drink more than you process. So in other words, you'll be 24 hours processing that particular dose of alcohol. The administration of a drug in measured amounts, or the determination of the correct or required amount. And in street talk and the street drug, how much of a drug is actually there. So when you're dealing with underground economy drugs, how much of the drug is actually part of the actual ingredient if you're using, for example, meth, cocaine, or heroin, or even street drugs. So potency is having to do with the strength of something such as a drug or alcoholic drink. So how strong the drug is, for example, less is more. Xanax is more powerful than Valium, heroin or methadone is stronger than Percocet, or opium, etc., etc. So there are different dosages and strengths, dosages and potency for various drugs, which is not something that's usually taught to people who are consuming those substances. So I often talk about an additive effect. For example, one drug and drug 1 plus drug 2 equals effect 3. So for example, coffee and alcohol, and coffee and THC. Now, because they're different drugs, caffeine works on different centers of the brain than alcohol does. Essentially, you are awake for the accident. Coffee doesn't sober you up. Neither does having a Jaeger bomb. Okay, because you have the alcohol in the Jägermeister, you have the Red Bull, but the Red Bull stimulants are acting on a different part of the brain and are not essentially making you more competent. You're simply, as I said before, awake for the accident. Coffee and marijuana, for example, if you combine the two, they work on different parts of the brain, so both effects are happening. So an agonist, that is drug 1 plus an agonist, so the example here is opiates and naloxone. So basically, when somebody's in a heroin overdose, their vital functions have stopped, paramedics will actually inject them with an agonist called, for example, naloxone or Narcan or something like that, and basically that immediately puts them in opiate withdrawal, and they come back, hopefully. So for example, a drug, hormone, or any other substance that triggers a response in a particular body, tissue, or group of cells by binding specific receptor molecules on or inside the cells, as if it were a bodily substance that normally binds there. That's essentially the definition of an agonist, and that's why naloxone works. So also antagonist is another name for those. So naloxone antagonists at mu-opioid receptors. So Subutex is one of the treatments for heroin or opiate use. So the reason I mention it here in this particular context is that a number of athletes routinely get prescription opiates like OxyContins and stuff like that and can become addicted. That is, defining addiction as no longer under doctor's care and then dependent on the substance. So often, even though the docs may say, oh, well, don't worry about being dependent on this drug. Here's another drug to get you off of that drug, and that drug is usually Suboxone or Subutex. So potentiating or a synergistic or multiplicative effect to improve the effectiveness of a drug-to-drug treatment, especially by adding another drug. So often what people will do, this effect is basically drinking alcohol on top of, your Valium or Xanax dose. While it may get you drunker, it also is more dangerous because it could actually cause respiratory collapse eventually, if not immediately, depending on how much you have to drink. So synergistic, in terms of drug effects, a drug that increases the effect of another drug. So alcohol in combination with nearly any other drug, particularly sedative hypnotics or opiates, is synergistic. So alcohol, Xanax, Valium, Ambien, barbiturates. So alcohol is so toxic that essentially the liver goes on red alert to processes it and virtually ignores any other drug until the alcohol is gone, and this is why there's a synergistic effect. So not only sedative hypnotics have this, but certain psychedelics like mushrooms should not be mixed with alcohol because of the toxin that is naturally occurring in the mushrooms is fairly damaging in the presence of alcohol because it's your liver that needs to detox the mushrooms by itself. So I'm not necessarily encouraging to use mushrooms by itself, but do not mix them with alcohol because that can really screw you up. The liver detoxifies all drugs and produces enzymes to digest and catalyze reactions, so that's often interrupted with the introduction of certain drugs, particularly alcohol. Now, in the early 1970s, Dr. Candace Pert discovered what she refers to as the molecules of emotion. So people often ask me, how do drugs work? So which came first, for example? Did the emotion trigger the release of the chemical in your brain and your body, or did the chemical cause the emotion? Basically, what Dr. Pert is suggesting is that your body is your subconscious mind. That is to say, that there's a constant communication between the nervous system and target organs in the body. And that the 85 or so neurohormones, neurotransmitters, neuropeptides that we've discovered that are part of this process, of these 85, I generally teach people about 10 of them. So think of these neurochemicals as words. Now the reason they're called neurochemicals is originally they were thought to exist only in the nervous system, and then it was later discovered that they're outside of the nervous system as well. So that tied up with your immune response, your white blood cells, certain leukocytes also use these neurotransmitters to guide their actions. So I've only identified 10 of them here that correspond with the major drugs of abuse. So if you kind of get this concept that these are like words and that the same word can be used different ways and take on different meanings at different times depending on where, how much, how intense it's used. So as an example, serotonin. Serotonin is basically involved with arousal, general data flow, body temperature, and regulating sleep. Dopamine is involved with pleasure, particularly and memory and brain reward. So how brain reward works with pleasure and memory is that all survival activities are associated with pleasure. So you're thirsty, you drink. You're hungry, you eat. You're tired, you sleep. Having sex, etc., etc. All those things are connected, all those survival activities are connected with pleasure, so they will be repeated. And dopamine is associated with those pleasure centers within the brain, i.e. brain reward. Endorphin literally means morphine within. So essentially what this morphine within does, it's produced in response to pain and it gives you emotional pain relief. So it actually doesn't cut the pain, you just feel better in the presence of the pain. You don't care as much. So endorphin is also released as one of the chemicals around orgasm.